Hi, good morning, everyone. How are y'all feeling today? Whew. I was up on time, and I was having such a good time. I had my music on in the room. I was getting dressed, getting my things together. And the elevator that I was on stopped at almost every floor. And I don't know if anybody in here was on there with me. Like, at half of the stops, there was literally no one getting on. So, just going to take some moments and get myself together. We're glad you all are here. I think there's like 7 other sessions that are going on right now. So if you chose to be here with us, that means a lot. So we appreciate you being here. My name is Bruce Hughes, and I am a program specialist in policy liaison and implementation in federal student aid. And this is...
Oh, my name is Aaron Washington. I've probably seen many of you at other presentations already, so hello again. I work in the Office of Post-Secondary Education, Policy Planning and Innovation, and I've been there for about 6 years. Before that, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Botswana. Do we have any former Peace Corps volunteers in here? Returned Peace Corps volunteers? None? Okay. Well.
Before we get started, I'd just like to learn a little bit about who we have in the room with us. Is this anyone's first FSA conference? Oh, excellent.
Whoa.
Well, welcome. We're glad y'all came. It's a lot of y'all, right?
It's a lot.
In terms of financial aid experience, who here has 1 year or less of experience? Okay. How about 1 to 5 years? Okay. 6 to 10? Okay. More than 11? Okay. Wow. All right. So the more than 11 group, you're not allowed to ask us any questions because you all have probably been doing this longer than we have. Well, this session will have a little bit for everybody. I think generally it's somewhere in the middle between beginning and intermediate, and we'll sprinkle in a couple of advanced topics as we go through. One more question. Did anyone here attend the new FAA boot camp earlier this week? It was on Monday. Hey, I see y'all in the back. Okay. Well, you all already know that there are a number of factors that we have to consider when we are evaluating eligibility for federal student aid. And what Aaron and I will do today is to walk you through some of those. We're going to do this in 3 different sections. Let me get myself together. Give me 1 second. All right. So first we'll look at eligibility that's determined as a result of a student completing the free application for federal student aid, or the FAFSA. Then we'll move to student eligibility requirements that don't require information from the department, but that your institution determines on its own whether the student meets the eligibility requirements. And then finally, we'll take a look at some eligibility requirements that are specific depending on the FSA program. All right, so let's get started with our first category, which is related to FAFSA processing. You all probably know this fundamental tenet of this, which is a student must complete a FAFSA to determine their eligibility for aid. That's their first step. And once a student submits their FAFSA, that information is sent to or processed by our Central Processing System, or CPS. There's a number of database checks. We're only going to look at about half of them, but database checks with the National Student Loan Data System, Department of Defense, Department of Justice, Social Security Administration, Veterans Affairs, Homeland Security, Selective Service System. We're going to cover the 4 that are on the screen today. Essentially what we'll be doing is walking through the chapters in volume 1 of the handbook. So you can take these, well, I think these slides will be up, or this session will be up soon. So you can come back to this and reference the specific chapters that you'll need to take a look at. We'll get started with citizenship, so I'm going to hand this over to Aaron.
Okay. So, to establish eligibility, a student has to be a U.S. citizen or national, or eligible non-citizen. Eligible non-citizens are individuals that are here for other than a temporary purpose with the intention of becoming a lawful permanent resident or U.S. citizen, and also individuals from the also individuals from the freely associated states are eligible for limited Title IV program funds. Generally, that would be Pell, and individuals from Palau would be eligible for federal work study and FSEOG. So on the slide are the categories of eligible non-citizen. Many of you won't know when an applicant applies for federal student aid, many of you won't know what their immigration designation is or status is because they will hopefully pass the automated match process. The only time you would ever know what an individual's immigration status is in the United States or need to know is if they fail the primary and secondary automated matches. So you really shouldn't be asking for immigration documentation unless they fail the automated match process for federal student aid purposes. Last year, we had a session solely dedicated to resolving eligibility issues for U.S. citizens and eligible non-citizens, and that's because we made the transition from paper-based confirmation. Some of you probably remember the G845 form, yes? Yeah, and so we made the transition to third step verification through the SAVE system. The SAVE system is the Systematic Alien Verification for Entitlements program. And so we kind of transitioned from calling it the G845 process to third step verification. And so if you're interested in learning more really in-depth in the weeds about resolving eligibility issues for citizens and eligible non-citizens, you can go on fsaconferences.ed.gov and you can go to the 2018 conference sessions, and you can hear me and Bruce and our colleague Maria Dennis on recording, and you can also review the slides from the presentation. So all FAFSAs are matched with the Social Security Administration. Generally, you have to have a valid Social Security number in order to submit your application. Of course, there's an exception, or there's a few exceptions to that rule. And if you indicate that you're an eligible non-citizen, you have to enter your alien registration number, and subsequently CPS will match you with the Department of Homeland Security database to ensure that you fall within one of those eligible non-citizen categories. So again, I think I've already said, but again, if there's two automated matches, so there's like a primary and secondary, and if they fail both of those, you will have to collect immigration documentation from the student, the financial aid office or the financial aid officer, and upload that information into the SAVE system, and wait about 3 to 5 business days, and the Department of Homeland Security will return the result of the individual's immigration status in the country, in the United States. And so the Department of Homeland Security won't tell you if the student is eligible or ineligible. They will tell you the student's immigration status. And so that could be like a lawful permanent resident, asylee, or a refugee. And then you would use the FSA handbook to determine eligibility. I do talk very fast, so if I am talking too fast, please let me know. I don't know if it's a characteristic of somebody I'm from Buffalo, New York, but I start to speed up through the presentations. I saw a hand back there. I answered a question yesterday at the open forum, and I could actually hear myself speed talking. Like I was like, wow, I'm talking way too fast. They talked about, actually, during, I think, the application processing update, one of the presenters during the general session discussed the next few slides yesterday, so I won't dwell on these slides for too long, but because we made the transition from paper-based third step verification to electronic third step verification, we released SAVE instruction manuals on our ifap.ed.gov website. And I think the current iteration, volume 3 or version 3.0, is about 42 pages. So it's packed with information on how to set up an account, how to manage the account, how to navigate the response screens, and also how to resend a record to matches if you need to generate a new case verification number. Also there are 3 videos that walk you through this. Our colleague Matt Brown recorded them, and I have been working with Matt Brown for 3 to 4 years at the Department of Education, but I work in the Office of Post-Secondary Education, and the Office of Federal Student Aid they're actually separate offices. One is by Union Station in DC, and the other is like in Southwest DC. And I had never met Matt Brown, and we talked every week for like 4 years. And the first time I ever saw him was on these videos, and so I had to I was like, this is enough. I have to go over there. It's like a 5-minute bus ride over there and meet Matt Brown. So you'll see him in the 3 videos if you want to check out the audio version of the SAVE instruction guide. So some updates that we made were how to resolve no cases found. I think in the version 3.0, there's about 7 steps you can work through to resolve no cases found. I would say one of the most important things is the additional request buttons. So VAWA is really a battered immigrants, qualified aliens, and they're given that designation under the Violence Against Women Act in Cuban Haitian entrance. So there's additional buttons in the SAVE system. If a student fails the automated match process, which generally battered immigrants, qualified aliens will fail the automated match, in order for the Department of Homeland Security to return a result of battered immigrant, qualified alien, or Cuban Haitian entrant, you have to click the additional request button. There's also a box there for additional comments. You can type in anything in those boxes. You can type in, I'm requesting VAWA verification, I'm requesting Cuban Haitian entrant verification. You can even type in, I'm requesting refugee or asylee or verification. But for those 2 specific categories, you have to click those because of the nature of the status. The status, when a record goes to 3rd step verification, there's actually a human at an individual reviewing the file at the Department of Homeland Security, so it's no longer automated. And so the status verifier has to know that you're looking for that specific category of eligible non-citizen in order to type that result into the response. PDPAs can now submit 3rd step verification requests. Before they couldn't. Before they had to assign a 3rd step only user. But a PDPA could assign themselves as a 3rd step only user, so they could always kind of submit those, but now you don't have to assign a 3rd step only user. You can just submit the 3rd step verification yourself. The application processing division website is listed on the slide. Of course, you can email me or Bruce with your policy questions. If it's about application processing, this would be the best email address to email or call the number. And they ask that you provide information, the case verification number, your name, your question, and the phone number. And your phone number. And so I'll turn it over to Bruce for the financial aid history.
Thanks, Aaron. Students who have previously attended another college before coming to yours might have a financial aid history if they received financial aid somewhere else. I'll refer to financial aid history as FAH to abbreviate that. We'll take a look at those database matches and also take a look at what students can do to gain or regain eligibility if they're currently ineligible. So to start, in order to be eligible for financial aid, you can't be in loan default, student can't have an overpayment, and they cannot have exceeded their annual or aggregate loan limits. The CPS doesn't perform any matches to determine whether the student is subject to a judgment lien on a federal debt, and that's not something that you're required to check for. However, if you know that that is the case, you are not able to, the student is ineligible for FSA funds until that's resolved. Additionally, a student who has been convicted of or who has pled no contest to or guilty to a crime involving fraud and FSA funds is ineligible for FSA funds until that debt has been repaid in full. So we learn about some of these things through the NSLDS database match. It's important that you resolve any conflicts between what you see in NSLDS and maybe what you have in your hand before you disperse for the student. We give an example in the handbook that says if NSLDS shows that a student is not in default, but you have some documentation that shows that they are, that you would need to resolve that. Typically, though, you might actually see that NSLDS shows the default, and the paperwork shows that it doesn't because NSLDS hasn't been updated. And if you're confident that that resolves the issue, then you can go ahead and award the student. Does anyone here, or has anyone here had to deal with students who received a total and permanent disability discharge who were going back to school? Okay. Oh, okay, well, that's more than I thought. It's good to know, okay. While reviewing a student's financial aid history, you might come across this case. And here I'm not talking about veterans. It's a separate process. Here I'm talking about someone who had their loan or teach grant service obligation discharged because they became totally and permanently disabled. In some cases, those students will want to return to school and potentially borrow again to complete another program. That is possible, but there are two, or really three, things that must happen. The first, the student needs to provide your institution with a physician certification that he or she can engage in substantial gainful activity. The second one is a signed statement acknowledging that this new loan or teach grant service obligation can't be discharged due to a current illness unless it deteriorates to the point where the student is again totally and permanently disabled. And finally, there's a post-discharge monitoring period of 3 years. And if the student wants to take out loans again, they will need to resume payment on the old loans before the new loans or teach grant can be awarded. In some cases where a student is ineligible, they can regain eligibility by resolving, or really in all cases, they can regain eligibility by resolving the issue. First is the student can actually just pay the debt in full, whatever that is. But maybe most of the time they're not able to actually do that right up front. So our second option is that the student can make satisfactory repayment arrangements. These satisfactory repayment arrangements don't necessarily immediately pull the student out of default. They will allow you to disperse aid, but the student, you might still see a defaulted flag on the student in NSLDS. Depending on the repayment arrangements that the student has made with the lender or whoever has the debt, they might be eligible for loan rehabilitation a little bit later. I won't go into loan rehabilitation now because it's kind of maybe a little bit too detailed, but we have more information about that, I want to say, in Chapter 3 of this volume. And I think that's all I want to say about financial aid history for now, and I want to turn this back over to Aaron to talk about the Social Security number.
So all students and parents have to enter a valid social security number on the FAFSA, and they're matched with the Social Security Administration to confirm name and date of birth. Parents without a valid social security number can enter all zeros on the FAFSA. So a question came up yesterday that I alluded to when I was speaking earlier. And it was a financial aid administrator or stakeholder came to the mic during the open forum and asked, it was an individual that was naturalized, and so they are a U.S. citizen, and they failed the automated match process with the Social Security Administration every year. And what you would have to do is just collect their certificate of naturalization and keep that on file. You don't have to continue collecting that each year, because generally once a student naturalizes, and even generally once a student is granted lawful permanent residency, those statuses generally aren't revoked by the Department of Homeland Security. And so if the student continues to fail the automated match process in the case that they submit to you a certificate of citizenship or a certificate of naturalization, they would have to reach out to the Social Security Administration to have their information updated within their systems. The Department of Education couldn't do that on the student's behalf. There is an exception, as I mentioned earlier. Students from freely associated states, that's the Republic of the Marshall Islands, Federated States of Micronesia, and the Republic of Palau. They enter they could have a social security number, so if they do have a valid social security number, then they can enter that on the FAFSA. But if they don't, they can enter three sixes, and the CPS will generate a pseudo social security number, and they should use that throughout the duration of their application for federal student aid for purposes of tracking eligibility used for Pell. So you could have a successful match, and if there's a successful match with the SSA, the student is good to go. They're eligible, or they've fulfilled that eligibility requirement. There could be no match. The student could have reported the wrong social security number. There could be a FAFSA data entry error in which you can call 1-800-4FED-AID if the student entered the correct social security number, but the output was incorrect. If there's an error in the social security database, the student would have to contact the Social Security Administration. There could be no match on name or date of birth. The student should update their name with the correct spelling or their date of birth with the correct date of birth. And if there's missing info, then no match will be conducted. If there's a death associated with the Social Security number, the student would have, if the student is still alive, they would have to contact the Social Security number, the Social Security Administration, to have that resolved. And I think that's it for Social Security match.
Thanks, Aaron. Get into selective service now. Males, which selective service system defines as any person assigned the sex of male at birth, age 18 to 25, are required to register with selective service system. Students who are required to register for selective service must do so. Let's try that again. Must do so in order to be eligible for FSA funds, but parents who want to borrow a PLUS loan aren't required to have registered. There are some exemptions to this rule. Some of the most common ones are the student is in the armed forces, they were born before 1960, or they just weren't here during the ages of 18 to 26. If you have cases where a student is clearly not required to register, you don't have to have the student request a status information letter. You can document it and move on. You should really only ask the student to get the status information letter from the selective service system if it's not clear if the student fits one of the exemptions, and you're not totally sure if you can award aid to that student. The CPS performs a match with the selective service system to determine if the relevant students are registered. The output document, when I say output document, I'm talking about the student aid report, the SAR, which goes to the student, and the institutional student information record, or ISER, that goes to the school. The results of the selective service match will be located on both of those. If the match shows that the student is registered or is exempt, you'll see a comment confirming that, and you'll be able to go ahead and award aid. If the match doesn't confirm the student's registration, or the student can't be registered, you will have a C code that you'll need to resolve. This will be printed on the student's ISER as well as on the SAR. And until the student resolves this registration problem, of course, they are not eligible for aid. We do have some cases where students have been denied aid because they failed to register with selective service before their 26th birthday. Part of the reason for this is that the selective service won't allow you to register after you've turned 26. So there's not really a way in most cases to remedy this if they already failed to register. It's still possible, though, for a student to receive aid if they can demonstrate that they did not knowingly and willfully fail to register. So unless you can document that the student meets one of the registration exemptions that I just covered and that we list in detail in the handbook, they'll need to write to the selective service to get a status information letter addressing their failure to register. When you have the student write this letter, you want them to include as complete a description as possible of the situation around them not registering. So, like maybe they weren't here, or maybe here in the States. Maybe they were institutionalized or incarcerated, or there's a lot of reasons, potentially. But they need to really set that story for the selective service in order to get that letter. When you get the letter, it could be a variety of codes. If the student is exempt, I think the codes are E1 through E8. It'll say the student meets one of the exemptions, they were not required to register. If a student was born before 1960 and they get a status information letter, which you really don't need if they were born before 1960, but if you want them to get the letter and they get the letter, there'll be a code on there that says they weren't required to register. If if the student does not meet one of the exemptions, the status information letter will sometimes give you helpful information to make an ultimate determination. So there's not so much a formal appeal process with the department. That decision rests with you. Depending on the information that you receive on the status information letter, it could say, we show that maybe the student did try to register, but it didn't go through. Or it might show something like, we've sent this person multiple letters and they responded to none of them. So in that case, you might have an argument that the student knowingly and willfully did not register. Some final points on this. Before finally making that determination, you do want to consider a couple of factors. Again, where was the student between the ages of 18 and 25? It's possible that if they weren't here, that they didn't know that they were required to register. Second, whether the student claims that they were even registered. And third, how the student got through all of the different ways that you can register. If they can provide some reason how they maybe they never got a driver's license, or they never got an ID, or things like that. I'll turn this back over to Aaron to kick off our discussion on school-determined eligibility requirements now.
All right, so are you guys still with us? I know it's Thursday. I think I've done, I don't even know how many presentations and sat in a few birds of a feather, and so I hope you're still with us. I'm still here with you guys. All right, so I'm gonna talk about, let's see. I'm going to talk about a regular student enrolled in an eligible program, elementary and secondary enrollment, and academic qualifications. And then Bruce is going to take over at SAP, I think all the way through, changing eligibility. Bruce has got a lot of topics ahead of him. So a student has to be a regular student and accepted for enrollment, enrolled or accepted for enrollment in an eligible institution to obtain a degree or certificate. So basically a regular student enrolled in an eligible program. There are several exceptions to this rule, but that's the general rule. We don't define acceptance, so if you offer a student conditional acceptance, as long as they're enrolled as a regular student in an eligible program, they're eligible for aid. A student is eligible for up to a year of remedial coursework, as long as that coursework is a part of the eligible program. And not listed on the slide is that students are also eligible for English as a second language coursework as a part of an eligible program, but there's no restriction to the year maximum like remedial coursework. So we'll get into the exceptions. One of the exceptions to enrolling as a regular student in an eligible program is if an individual wants to enroll in a post-baccalaureate teacher certification program, they can receive Pell for that. And there's a few rules around that. The school can't offer, it can't lead to a graduate degree. The school can't offer a bachelor's in education. And basically the program has to lead to initial licensure or licensure, and the coursework has to help the student achieve that licensure in order to teach. Another exception is students with intellectual disabilities can receive Pell, FSA, and Federal Work Study to enroll in comprehensive transition and post-secondary programs. These programs are defined in the Code of Federal Regulations at Part 668.231. So if you're interested in knowing the eligibility requirements for students or what the programs have to entail in order for the student to receive Title IV aid to enroll in one of these programs, you can reference the Code of Federal Regulations. Okay, so, so it's 668.231. So is everybody familiar with the Code of Federal Regulations? We actually get these, so the Code of Federal Regulations is where all of our, I guess the regulations that kind of authorize the Higher Education Act authorizes the Title IV programs, but the Code of Federal Regulations implements the programs. And so Congress might say a student has to complete secondary education in order to be eligible for Title IV aid as defined by the Secretary. And then we go through a process of negotiated rulemaking, which is kind of unique to the Department of Education, where we call in stakeholders from the community. We meet periodically. Generally, they're 3 to 4 sessions, three-day sessions each. and we received feedback from you all about what that should mean. And it could mean a GED certificate, or it could mean a state certificate. And then we put that into the regulation. We put that into a notice of proposed rulemaking. You comment on that. And then we make some changes, some tweaks, and then we publish a final regulation. So, and all those regulations are published in the Federal Register, but then they make their way to this really big book called the Code of Federal Regulations. And in fact, I got an email, I think yesterday, that we got the new books. I forgot what color they were for this year, but they're a different color each year with any changes or amendments or updates that we've made to the regulations. Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. So a student can't receive Title IV aid if they're enrolled in elementary or secondary school, even if they're enrolled in eligible post-secondary coursework at the same time. And I'm going to jump into academic qualifications. I'm going to skip by this slide because this is all covered on the next few slides. So actually, I'll talk about it. So in order to be eligible for Title IV aid, you have to have a high school diploma or its recognized equivalent. In the law, it says that you can also be homeschooled, and also you can fulfill one of the ability to benefit alternatives if a student doesn't have a high school diploma. But there's some criteria around that, establishing eligibility under ability to benefit, which we'll talk about more in a few slides. So your institutions, you're required to have, if you have any reason to, if you believe there's a discrepancy in an individual's high school completion status, you have to have some sort of process or some sort of policy to validate high school diplomas at your institutions to ensure that they are valid. And that's in the regulations at 668.16. But we did release an electronic announcement on July 23rd, 2019. I think I'm actually listed as the point of contact in that electronic announcement. And we basically say that we always, the department doesn't define high school diplomas. We leave that to the states. And so we always have said in policy that we defer to the state determination as to what constitutes a high school diploma. And are you all familiar with our program integrity website at ed.gov, like the landing page? So there we have a lot of Q&As that a lot of people don't really know about. There's Q&As on verification, there's Q&As on high school completion. I think there's some Q&As on SAP and retaking coursework. And there we have a Q&A that, it's in writing that we always rely on the state's determination as to what constitutes a high school diploma. And so the electronic announcement basically restates that information and also lets you know that you have safe harbor from any, I'm not a compliance officer, so I can't really get into that, but I guess you have safe harbor against any audit or compliance finding if you contact the state and the state validates the high school diploma and says that it is a valid high school diploma, and then you subsequently, future years down the road, find out that the school may have been not a valid high school or it was not a valid high school diploma. But if the state says it's valid, then you have safe harbor. The recognized equivalents to a high school diploma are listed on the slide. It's a GED certificate, the General Educational Development Certificate, a state certificate after a student has passed a state-authorized examination. And what that really means is we're aware that, well, one of the tests, the student has to take the GED test, right, to get any certificate. But we found out a few years ago, 2015, that some states were offering other options for for students to acquire a high school equivalency certificate or high school equivalency diploma. One of the tests was the high school equivalency test. The other test was the test assessing secondary completion. And so some states either moved away from offering the GED test, or some states offered all three or a combination of three. There may be some that I don't even know about. The department doesn't keep a list of state authorized examinations, but that's really what it means. So if a student in a state that uses the task, passes the task, and the state offers a high school equivalency diploma, that the student would have met that equivalency. The next two bullets on the slide aren't actually in regulation. That's sub-regulatory guidance on the program integrity website that I was speaking about. So if you just go into a search engine and type in program integrity high school Q&A, it'll probably be the first link on there. And so the regulation actually says a student successfully complete at least a 2-year program that is acceptable for full credit towards a bachelor's degree. And before I got to the department, I think a lot of questions came in about what that meant. And so we defined in sub-regulatory guidance what that meant. And it could be an associate's degree or some amount of credits towards an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree. And the final option is well, my former boss, Carney McCullough, who used to always present on student eligibility, referred to as the Doogie Howser rule. I didn't really grow up watching Doogie Howser. I was more of a Dexter's Laboratory type of guy. And so, he was the boy genius. And so if you all have students that excelled academically in high school and you have a policy for accepting those students, they would be eligible. And we don't define excelled academically. So we're going to dive into what I think has been a pretty hot topic for the last year. It's been one of the main things that I've worked on in the department for the last year. It was really spearheaded by our Office of Career, Technical and Adult Education, and its ability to benefit. And ability to benefit is the process by which a student without a valid high school diploma has access to Title IV aid. The ability to benefit. There's a couple of options. So if a student was enrolled in a eligible program prior to July 1st, 2012, and they fulfill one of the ability to benefit alternatives, they can enroll as a regular student in any eligible program even if they don't have a high school diploma. And then Congress struck that from the law in around 2011, 2012. And they made some amendments to the law in about 2014. And so for a student without a high school diploma who wants to pursue post-secondary education, to enroll, they have to not only fulfill one of the ability to benefit alternatives, but they also have to enroll in an eligible career pathway program. And so I think I kind of tripped over explaining that. But if they were enrolled in an eligible program prior to July 1st, 2012, they have to fulfill one of the alternatives, and they can enroll in any eligible program. If they were enrolled after July 1st, 2012, they have to fulfill one of the ability to benefit alternatives, and they also have to enroll in a career pathway program, eligible career pathway program. So there was one additional eligibility requirement that was placed on students if they want to enroll and receive Title IV aid after July 1st, 2012. And please come up and ask questions if I was not clear about that. So these, on the slide, these are the ability to benefit alternatives. The student could either pass an independently administered tests approved by the Department of Education. They're commonly referred to as ATB tests. And I think that we linked to the electronic announcement from 2015 listing the department-approved ability to benefit test. A student could pay for on their own. I know there's grant funding that some students use outside of Title IV aid to complete 6 credits or 225 clock hours. I know there's also institutional funds that some institutions use to help students do this. Or they can complete a state process. So far, no state process has been approved by the Department of Education. We have received some applications for the state process, but none have been approved yet. We are working to produce a webinar that I'll be presenting along with one of my colleagues who I will present on the next slide. In the few weeks following the conference to walk schools through the state process and the department's policy on the state process and applying for that. All of the information that you need about the ability to benefit is in Dear Colleague Letter Gen 1609, so it's even more information in there than I've gone over. As I mentioned, if a student wants to receive Title IV aid without a high school diploma after July 1st, 2012, they have to fulfill one of the ability to benefit alternatives and also enroll in the eligible career pathway program. The eligible career pathway programs, my office is not the expert on. It's the Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education. So we have a front row resource, Aaron Berg, if you wouldn't mind standing up. Hi, Aaron. She has really led the way for the last year on really promoting ability to benefit in the community and letting the financial aid community and all stakeholders know about this alternative pathway to Title IV aid for students without a high school diploma. And so during the Q&A portion, if you all have questions on career pathway programs, I'm actually going to let Erin come up and talk at the end of the presentation for just a little bit to talk about what she's been working on. But if you have any questions on career pathway programs, she is going to be the one to answer those questions. I did want to just point one of the bullets on the slide, and it's the second to last bullet that says enables an individual to attain a high school diploma or its recognized equivalent and at least one recognized post-secondary credential. So a career pathway program has to have two components, a post-secondary component and a secondary component. The student can only be paid with Title IV aid for the post-secondary component, and that's including establishing the student's enrollment status in the program. And I'll turn it over to Bruce for satisfactory academic progress.
Thanks, Aaron. Another requirement to be eligible for FSA funds is for your school to have a reasonable policy on measuring a student's satisfactory academic progress, or SAP. We consider a policy to be reasonable if it has both a qualitative and quantitative component that measures the student's academic progress in a program at certain scheduled intervals. Your SAP policy must be at least as strict as the policy for students who are not receiving FA for the same program. And you can have different SAP policies depending on certain categories. So like one for full-time students, or one for students in a certain program, or one for part-time students. In all cases, the SAP policy must have two components. There's a qualitative component, so we want to qualitatively think grade-based GPA. Quantitative, you want to think about pace and maximum time frame, so how long is the student taking to complete the program. When we talk about qualitative, the Higher Education Act requires a qualitative review at the end of, if the program is longer than 1 year, at the end of each second year, and students enrolled in a program of more than 2 academic years must have a GPA of at least C or its equivalent, or that's consistent with your school's graduation requirements. Essentially what we're saying there is, if a student at your school needs to graduate with a 4.0, and at the end of the second year, the student has a 0.0, they are not on track. So whatever they need to be on track at certain points, specifically at the second year, you need to make sure that the student has that qualitative element met. Additionally, the policy must have a quantitative focus. And here we're looking at something that we call PACE, which is essentially how students are progressing through their program. We calculate PACE by taking the amount of credits that the student completed and dividing it into the number of students, number of credits that the student actually attempted altogether. And that needs to that percentage needs to typically be 67%. It can be higher because you can set that yourself. But you need to make sure for undergraduate students that the student is on pace to complete their program within 150% of the published length. So if the program is 4 years, essentially they need to be done in 6. Or if the program's done in 2, they effectively need to be done in 3. You can review SAP more frequently, so depending on your school, like I used to work at a quarter school, and so we did an evaluation at the end of each period. There are certain benefits to doing that. You can use a warning status, you can also have appeals, but you could review it more frequently. So maybe you wanted to review it every month or every week. You could do that, but that cannot count as the official evaluation for SAP. That typically happens at the end of the payment period. David Bartnicki, some of you might have been to his sessions already. I think he has a competing session right now where he talks about SAP. And if you've never heard David Bartnicki talk about SAP, you really need to go to his presentation. The recordings will be uploaded shortly after this session ends. The slides are up now, but I would recommend that you download that SAP presentation. He goes into a lot of detail on differences between credit and clock hour programs. He goes into each requirement with a lot of specificity that you'll need to have if your SAP policy is going to be considered reasonable at the department standards. A couple of slides I'll get through kind of quickly here. Another school-determined eligibility requirement has to do with enrollment status. Of course, a student needs to be enrolled at least half-time to receive direct loans, so sub, unsub, or plus loans. Pell, Teach Grant, and campus-based programs don't require half-time enrollment except for when it does. There are 3 exceptions. One's related to teacher education, post-baccalaureate programs, teaching credential programs, and if you have a student who's going for additional year-round Pell. So if they're eligible for more than 100% of their scheduled award, only if they are going to be enrolled half-time. We consider half-time to be exactly half of what full-time is. And so depending on your school, full-time might be 12 hours, 12 semester hours if you're semester or trimester, a certain number of hours if you're a clock hour program, if you don't use semester, trimester, quarter hours. We have all of these definitions in this chapter in the handbook. One point there is that the regulations do not set a minimum for full-time for graduate students. That's only for undergraduate students. Moving on to drug convictions. The main point here that I think I need to get across is that if there was an offense that occurred while the student was receiving Title IV aid, then that is problematic as it results to eligibility for FSA programs. If you have a student who committed or had an offense during a period where they were not in school and not enrolled, this does not apply. If you have a conviction that was, well, not you, if the student has a conviction that was reversed, set aside, or annulled, or they were tried as a juvenile, then that doesn't play a role in their eligibility. And the student's eligibility for financial aid begins the day after these periods on the screen end. Next, for incarcerated students, we consider a student to be incarcerated if he or she is serving, gotta get this right, a criminal sentence in a federal, state, local penitentiary, prison, jail, reformatory, work farm, or similar correctional institution, whether it's government-run or run by a private contractor. No student who is incarcerated in a federal or state penal institution can receive Pell Grant, but they might be eligible for Pell, FSEOG, and federal work study if they are incarcerated in a juvenile justice facility, local or county jail, or local or county penitentiary or correctional facility. You can accept the student self-certification that they are no longer incarcerated. You don't have to do any digging to get to the bottom of it if they say that they aren't. Rounding out our second section here, I have to talk about conflicting information. The main point here is that if the student put one thing on their FAFSA and you see or hear or come across information that makes you question the validity of what they put on the FAFSA, that needs to be resolved. Conflicting information needs to be resolved before you disperse funds to a student. And if you become aware of conflicting information after the disbursement has already happened, then you would need to resolve that before you disperse any more funds. Generally speaking, conflicting information always needs to be resolved if the student is enrolled or planning on re-enrolling. Really, the only exception to having to resolve conflicting information is if, unfortunately, the student passes during that award year, or if the student leaves and is not planning on coming back and you don't intend on seeing them again. Finally, my last slide here relates to change in eligibility status. The main point here, and I think I'll use an example to illustrate this, depending on when the student gains eligibility, that could determine for what periods the student is eligible to receive funding. So I have one example. Let's say we have a student, his name is DeAndre, and he is in a fall, spring standard academic year. During the spring, so after fall, DeAndre's transcripts are finally received, and he is admitted into a Title IV eligible program. For that specific term in spring, DeAndre is eligible for Pell, for Teach Grant, for campus-based and direct loans for that payment period only. There's a different case, however, where I'll use a different example. We'll say a student named Tyrone. If Tyrone resolves either a citizenship issue, an issue related to selective service system, or to the Social Security number, same example, he's enrolled in fall and spring and gets whatever that is resolved in spring, one of those three, he can get Pell for that entire award year and still direct loans for that payment period. I'm going to turn this over to Aaron now to get started with our final section of the presentation, eligibility for specific programs. We have about 10 minutes if you want to allow them to have 15 minutes for the question.
Okay. I'll just get through this quickly. I think we have to leave time for questions. I guess my fast talking might have helped for this presentation. I don't know. So we have a presentation later on Pell. If you want to come, I'm presenting with Marie Fitzpatrick and Daniel Barkowitz from Valencia College. But generally, students are only eligible for their, I think the regulations say their first baccalaureate course of study. So basically, they're undergraduate students only. They're limited to a 600% lifetime eligibility used, which is basically 6 scheduled awards. If they're enrolled in an additional term, obviously they're going to be exhausting their eligibility faster. Bruce already talked about incarcerated students, and we'll go to the next slide. So Iraq and Afghanistan Service Grant is for individuals, students whose parents died as a result of military service in Iraq or Afghanistan after September 11th, 2001. And so this could have occurred at any time if the student was less than 24 years old. I'm sorry? Oh, I thought we had a question. Less than 24 years old. If the student was older than 24 years old when the parent died, they would have to have been enrolled in an eligible post-secondary institution at the time of the parent's death. Iraq and Afghanistan service grants, if the student is Pell eligible, the eligibility is calculated at a 0 EFC. If the student is not Pell eligible, they will receive, so if the student is Pell eligible, they basically receive a Pell grant. If the student is not Pell eligible, they receive an Iraq and Afghanistan service grant. Now there may be a discrepancy in the amounts that the students receive because I think full Pell for 2019-2020 is $6,195, but the Iraq and Afghanistan service grant is subject to sequestration, so I can't remember the number off the top of my head. If one of you wants to go on studentaid.ed.gov and shout it out to everybody, don't be shy, but it's a little less than the max Pell award. We do a database match for the Iraq and Afghanistan service grant with Department of Defense. In Bruce's office, FSA PLI policy liaison and implementation, they send a personalized letter to any individual that qualifies for either Pell under the Iraq and Afghanistan service grant requirements or the Iraq and Afghanistan service grant itself. We have another scholarship, which is for the children of fallen heroes. This is Pell eligible students whose parents or guardians died in the line of duty while performing as a public safety officer. They're eligible for Pell calculated at a 0 EFC. For the one difference between the Iraq and Afghanistan service grant with the Children of Fallen Heroes scholarship is that the individual has to be Pell eligible. There's no component if the student is not Pell eligible. There's no funds available if the student is not Pell eligible. So there's a couple of requirements defined in statute, but generally a public safety officer is a police officer, a firefighter, or a chaplain. I think there's other categories. If you're interested in knowing the other categories, during the Q&A session, I can look them up really quick on my phone, and I can go through them with you. And I think that's it. Oh, the eligibility requirements for the Iraq. So for the Children of Fallen Heroes scholarship is if the student is older than 24 years old, the parent must have died in the line of duty at a time when the student was enrolled in an eligible post-secondary institution. And I think Bruce has a few more slides, and we'll be.
So I want to talk about eligibility for direct loans, and on the slide is the exception. So I actually need to tell you like the rule. So a couple of things related to direct loans. First, to be eligible for direct loans, undergraduate students attending a school that participates in Pell Grant, they need to have Pell awarded first. So like you always award Pell before you award direct loans. And if your school participates in Pell, you need to award Pell before you award direct loans. Second, direct subsidized and direct unsubsidized loans are two components of the same program. So you can't award just subsidized loans or choose to award just unsubsidized loans. Those need to be awarded in tandem, like if the student is eligible. So there are some cases where students might have, exceeded their max sub and you can't award them more, but you can't choose to say, I'm only going to give out subsidized loans ever, or say the same thing for unsub. That's not okay. The third point I want to bring to your attention as it relates to PLUS loans is that your school can choose whether it wants to participate in the PLUS loan program. When your financial aid director submits their eligibility application to participate in programs, they'll say, here are the programs that we want to be involved in. So you could choose not to participate. But if you do choose to participate, you have to make sure that you make PLUS loans eligible for both dependent undergraduate students as well as graduate professional students. So you can't say like, oh, well, one population is a little bit more risky. I only want to give this out to parents. That doesn't work. If you have undergraduate students at your campus and you have graduate students, you must make PLUS loans available to both of those populations. Now to the exception that's on the screen. As it relates to preparatory coursework, a student can use direct loans for coursework that the school determines is necessary for the student to enroll in that program. Those courses must be offered as part of an eligible program at your school, although it doesn't have to be the same program that the student ultimately is getting matriculated into. You cannot award loans for standalone courses that don't apply to any degree, so you just can't give out loans to take random classes. Move this slide. Some general requirements on campus-based aid. Unlike the direct and PLUS loan programs, a student does not have to be enrolled at least half-time in order to be eligible to receive campus-based aid, unless the student is seeking aid to attend a teacher certification or professional credential program. Students are eligible for federal work study at practically every level of their academic career, as an undergraduate student, a graduate student, or a professional student. They're all eligible for federal work study. When it comes to Federal Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant, or FSEOG, that's only for students who do not have a baccalaureate degree. So you could have a graduate student get federal work study, but they should not get any FSEOG. And also, with one more campus-based programs related to Perkins, there should be no loans for Perkins now. Yeah, that program stopped June 30th, 2018, I think. So like, there might still be some Perkins work going on at your campus, like assigning them or servicing them or processing them, but you should not see any Perkins loans on anyone's financial aid offer letters as of like now. Finally, I want to talk about Teach Grants. The Teacher Education Assistance for College and Higher Education Teach Grant program provides $4,000 annually to students who plan to become teachers. As a condition for receiving Teach Grant, students must agree to teach full-time in a high-need field for at least 4 academic years at a primary school, secondary school, or educational service agency that focuses on low-income families. The grant recipient is required to complete 4 years of teaching within this larger 8-year period after they complete their program. And if the grant recipient does not meet that obligation, the Teach Grant is converted to a loan, an unsubsidized loan with interest that needs to be repaid. I know that this has been in the news and in the press a bit recently, and the TEACH regulations, I believe there's a notice of proposed rulemaking that's going to be coming out soon that has, and really the goal there is to try to minimize the amount of grants that are converted to loans. I think it's session 14, the regulatory update. I'm not sure what day it's happening. I think Anne Marie is doing it, so if you...
Sophia.
Oh, thank you. Sophia is doing it, so if you want to hear more about that, you can go to that session or just watch the video when you're on your way home. We wanted to leave plenty of time, or as much time as possible, for questions. We're going to have...
Hey, Aaron, do you want to come up and say just a few things?
Yeah,
Okay.
Aaron,
All right.
come up.
Just she flew all the way down here, so.
And then if you have questions, you can start to line up. I guess this is
I'll
our
have the
only
mic, please.
right here.
I'm gonna spill your energy drink. You need to have energy. Oh, it's just a Perrier. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for letting me come and have a couple minutes of time during this session. My name is Erin Berg, and my title is Community College Program Specialist. So I primarily support community colleges in areas related to adults, basic education, career and technical education, and various other sort of career pathways activities. But I do have some history with federal student aid. I spent a couple years in program compliance, and so I also like to take that history that I have to help community colleges and technical colleges with sort of topics like ability to benefit. And the reason why I'm here and the reason why we've been doing some joint work with Aaron over the past year is that we started hearing from community colleges and also from state college systems, with the Wisconsin Technical College System, the Mississippi Community College System in particular, that they were looking to expand the use of ability to benefit, either because they had sort of a mission focus to help more low-income and low-skilled adults in their community, or because they were hearing from employers that there's a skills gap. They have low unemployment rates, or they're just not finding the talent that they need locally, so they're looking to both help individuals and help businesses get together by providing post-secondary career pathway programs for those individuals. And I'm here because a lot of the colleges and states were saying that our financial aid staff could really benefit from hearing from the department that this is something that has been back for a couple of years now, because I know that it existed and maybe you were doing it for a long time, then it went away, and then it came back with that funny disbursement schedule, and then it came back with this funny career pathways definition. So I'm just here to talk to people, to provide a face to a name, take your contact information, and to try to work out any specific questions you have about programs or how to document career pathways. And so I'll be here until tomorrow. I'll be at the student eligibility session that's being done tomorrow, and then I fly home Saturday morning. So I have plenty of time to chat with you in between sessions, or to get your email, or to give you my card as well.
Thank you, Aaron.
Sure.
And the question on the mic.
My question is regarding selective service. What would be the best documentation when you have a transgender student who was born female but is now designated as male?
Selective service system only requires students who were assigned the sex of male at birth to register. So if you have a student who is female to male transition, there's an exemption for that. So you don't need to, there's nothing you need to do there.
So we don't need any documentation because their FAFSA says they're male, because that's what they are now.
So specifically for the match, if the sex assigned at birth is not male, they're not required to register. So there's...
So the gender at birth is what they should be answering on the FAFSA?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Go, yeah, please.
Okay. Hi. This is for the total permanent disability C code. Can you explain why we have to have a physician? Why can't we have a physician's assistant or a PA or an RN fill out the form for the students?
I don't know. I've never got that question before.
We have a lot of students that we have to kick the form back because they had an RN or a PA fill it out.
I will take that back. And on the next slide, we have our contact information. Sorry. And just like get my email so I could respond to you. And I think all of the questions that we get that we have to take back, we're going to post them on the conference website so everybody will be able to have the answer. So thank you for that.
Hi. Regarding the career pathway, you had mentioned that they would have to be enrolled. Can they enroll while they're already enrolled in the program? Like, say, for example, if they started out as a cash pay student and then maybe a month or so later they decided that they wanted to take advantage of FA funds, could they then enroll in a career pathway program, or do they have to be enrolled prior to enrollment? Do you understand the question?
So the eligibility requirements for individuals who enroll in a program after July 1st, 2012, who want to enroll in a program after July 1st, 2012 and receive Title IV aid if they don't have a high school diploma, is that they take an ATB test or 6 credits, and then once they complete either of those or 225 clock hours, they can subsequently, they fulfilled one of the ability to benefit alternatives, right?
I understand
eligibility
that point.
requirement, and then they can enroll in the eligible career pathway program.
So I guess my question is, say after 90 hours, they decide that they don't want to do the 225, they want to go ahead and...
Oh, after
be a
90
career
credit hours? Have they taken
No,
90?
clock hours.
90 clock hours?
Yeah, so I understand
Got it.
the ability to benefit
Yeah.
with the 225 clock hours. But then there's also the ability, right, if they're enrolled in an eligible career pathway program and they take a approved test, like the Wonderlic test or one of those exams. So if they decide before the 225 hours that they want to go that route, can we go ahead and allow them to do that?
Yeah, if they've taken 90 clock hours and then they just want to take on their own with their own funds, and they want to take an ability to benefit test after that, and they then subsequently enroll in a career pathway program, yeah, as long as they pass the test. I mean, that's the test
So
is one.
they might start out and say, you know, I can afford to pay for this, and then,
Understood.
oh my goodness, I can't
I
afford,
okay,
and now I
yes,
just need to
yeah.
go ahead and take a test.
Yeah.
And then enroll in, say, a GED prep class or an adult high school program or something like that, so that they would become eligible. I just want to make sure that
sure.
they're able to.
So I think the question was, and I'm looking at Aaron, if the student takes 90 clock hours, right, they haven't fulfilled one of the ability to benefit alternatives, right, because it's 225 clock hours at least. But then subsequently the student exhausts their funds and wants to take an ability to benefit test instead. That is one of the eligibility criteria. If they take the test and pass the test, they would have established eligibility through that other alternative to enroll in an eligible career pathway program. Now, keep in mind, if a student is enrolled in an eligible program prior to July 1st, 2012, that's all they have to have done. They only have to have enrolled in a program. Even if they didn't fulfill one of the ability to benefit alternatives, they could fulfill one of the ability to benefit alternatives today and enroll as a regular student in any eligible program. But as long as they fulfill one of those alternatives, they can enroll in a career pathway program. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to make sure that it's clear that the 225 credit hours or the 6 credits, you have to find some other funding. So it has to be their own, yeah. It's just, if you think of them on two gates to the pathway, the career pathway, it's either the test or the 6 credits or 225 hours. They just
So
have to
like you might have a
open
student
one of
that
those
comes
gates.
in and maybe they fail the test the first time,
You're probably
right?
going to see more of that. You're probably going to see more students that have come in and tried to take AccuPlacer or one of the ATB tests, and go figure, they're not good at algebra, so they're not going to get a score on one of those tests. It's a lot of states and a lot of colleges are doing this 6 credit option because they know that the student may not pass that test, but they could pass, you know, math for licensed practical nurses. They could, it may be better for them to be able to do that. So they could take the 6 credits, and that's the gate that they open in order to get into the funding for their career pathway.
Thank you. And what is the expectation from the department that the students are going to actually successfully obtain their high school diploma or equivalency? Because, and the reason why I say that is because, you know, we have students that come in for the career pathway program, and the program may only be 600 clock hours. So the reality is that they're not going to have enough time to, someone that has a 10th grade education to now all of a sudden get a high school diploma when our program is only 600 clock hours. So yes, we can enroll them in an eligible career pathway program, but then by the time they graduate from our school, they're still not going to have a GED or a high school diploma at that time.
So there's no requirement that the student actually obtain the secondary certificate, the high school diploma, the high school equivalency diploma, whatever it may be. It's just that the program offers or enables, the statute actually says enables an individual to attain a high school diploma or its recognized equivalent. So the career pathway program has to have those two components. But if you look in the Dear Colleague letter, Gen 1609, we have a Q&A, and we even go as far to say that a student doesn't have to be enrolled in the post-secondary component and the secondary component in the same term. It could be, the student could maybe only be enrolled in the post-secondary coursework for a couple of terms and obtain a credential or a certificate, and as long as they don't have to be
Simultaneously.
Simultaneous.
Yeah.
And so the student may not obtain that high school equivalency, but there's not a requirement. This program has to offer it. We have a 5-minute warning. I'm sorry, y'all. You have another question?
I
Follow-up?
have one more question. I promise, and I'm done. Okay, so what is the
Wait, hang on.
responsibility for the school to make sure that the students are engaged in this additional program?
You know what? Actually, I'll answer that question, and then you can come up and see us. So can you
Okay.
repeat that one last?
So what is the department's expectation for the school to make sure that the student is engaged in that secondary program? So for example, we partner with different educational companies to provide it, but the students might log in once and then never go in again. So are you expecting us to monitor their activity as well, or do we just show you that they've enrolled, that's it?
Well,
And-
we don't approve career pathway programs. You have to make a good faith effort to comply with the statute, right? That's outlined in the Higher Education Act and WIOA, correct? Yes. And Perkins, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. However, you would document in the student's file that they have completed the components of, or that they're enrolled in a career pathway that meets the definition in the law, and that the student is fulfilling the components of the career pathway program as you have established it at your institution.
Okay.
Yeah, if you're in an institution that doesn't actually offer the adult component on site, like you're not at a community college or you have an MOU with a local K through 12 system that's doing your adult education, states differ on those. I have some ideas about how you could do that in the student's file. Please come see me. I'm happy to chit chat with
Okay,
it. If
thank
you're in an
you.
institution that does that, it should be part of their registration record that they're enrolled in that program as well.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Real quick follow-up from I think my first question. If the student's gender identity is now male, but he was assigned the sex of female at birth, the student is not required to register with Selective Service. And because they are not required to, we don't have any guidance on, we don't have a position on what you use to approve that. So I think you use what information you have to make that determination. We don't have a position on that either way. Thank you.
Hello.
Hi, I have a question about the sex offenders, where it says in here is subject to involuntary civil commitment. What exactly does that mean? Because where I work, we serve secondary and post-secondary students, and we just had a situation recently where we had to dismiss a student because he was violating his probation by being on our campus. But he also received aid because he had been on probation for several years, and we were unaware at the time. He wasn't a verified file, so we didn't know.
Subject to an involuntary civil commitment, let me see what that law actually says, sorry. What slide was that on?
It's on 44. What are you trying to find?
And subject to involuntary civil commitment.
I know it's in chapter.
Following incarceration. So it basically, sometimes after a sex offender is released from prison, they are subject to some sort of, they may have to reside in a location where they're monitored, or there may be some involuntary commitment that they have to fulfill post incarceration. And so if they're subject to any commitment post incarceration, then they wouldn't be eligible for federal student aid.
So you're saying if they're still on parole for that?
If
during
they're still
their
on-
probation, because this particular student, he was on probation for 10 years. So, but he received aid because at the time we didn't know. He wasn't a verified file. He'd been working, for a couple of years, so his income, I mean, everything was good on his ICER, and so we had no idea.
We had no
Our
idea.
instructor just kind of had a hunch about him, and so then we looked him up, and then we found him in the database.
In the database?
Yeah.
If you can email me about that specific case, I can probably get you an answer
Okay.
pretty quickly about that specific case. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Hello.
Hi. For eligible non-citizens,
Yes.
students who are paroled in the United States for at least a year, the handbook mentions they also provide either like the I-45 or the I-130 to prove they're going to stay in the country for a permanent period. Does the application for asylum, the 589, does that also fulfill that requirement?
So generally, we state in the handbook that individual that's paroled, they have to be paroled for at least a year, and they have to submit documentation that they are here for other than a temporary purpose. And that documentation generally is in the form of I-45 or application for lawful permanent residency. And what was the document? They submitted an application for asylum?
Yeah, the 589 for asylum.
That would have to be I'd have to take that back for a deeper policy discussion with our eligible non-citizen team. I'm on the eligible non-citizen team. We meet once a month, and I can definitely bring that back. For now, I will say that the student would have to submit an I-485 or the application for lawful permanent residency if they're a parolee, parole for at least a year. And so, so that would be my current policy guidance, and I will take that back to see if an application for asylum would be sufficient to show that the individual was here for other than a temporary purpose.
Great, thanks.
Thank you so much. Oh, I have to stop. I'm sorry, y'all. Can you guys, so can we, is there another session in here afterwards? Oh, okay. I'm gonna go outside and stand outside the door if you have any more questions. I think I have a Pell presentation at 10:15, but I wanna make sure I honor these questions that are at the mic. I apologize.